In the modern world, the hum of the refrigerator is so constant, so ordinary, that we scarcely notice it anymore. A quiet guardian of our groceries, it keeps milk fresh, meat safe, and leftovers edible. At any given time, we open the door, and cool air drifts out, protecting everything inside. But for nearly all of human history, this convenience did not exist. In medieval times, there was no electrical current flowing through homes, no appliance humming quietly in the corner, no supermarket shelves lined with chilled dairy or frozen vegetables. Instead, there was only the immediate world, the sun, the rain, the seasons, and the constant threat that food might spoil before it could be eaten. This was a world where preservation was not a choice, it was a necessity for survival. Every bite of food was hard-earned. Whether grown, hunted, gathered, or traded, every morsel represented hours of labor. The failure to preserve food was not merely inconvenient, it could be disastrous. A spoiled crop or a failed preservation method could mean hunger during the long, dark months of winter. The medieval household existed in a perpetual dance with nature's clock. The harvest season was short, and the storage season was long. Without modern transportation, food often had to be grown, preserved, and consumed locally. Communities needed to predict how much they would need to survive the year, and prepare accordingly. Imagine, for a moment, the early morning sun rising over a small medieval village. The dew glistens on the thatched roofs. Smoke curls lazily from stone chimneys. Inside, a family gathers around a simple wooden table. On the table lies a small loaf of bread, perhaps some salted pork, a little hard cheese, and a mug of ale. These were staples that could last for weeks or months if stored correctly. But each item had its own method of preparation, carefully designed to slow down the relentless march of decay. Without cold storage, medieval people had to become masters of time. They needed to understand how long food could last before it turned. They had to recognize the signs of spoilage and balance immediate needs with long-term survival. Knowledge about food storage was passed down from generation to generation, often orally, and became part of the unspoken rhythm of life. Meat, for example, was one of the most challenging foods to preserve. Fresh meat began to rot within a day or two, especially in the heat of summer. But people found solutions. Salting, smoking, and drying could extend its life dramatically. Fish, likewise, was salted heavily, or dried under the sun. These methods worked because they removed moisture, making it harder for bacteria to grow. Fruits and vegetables presented their own challenges. Many could not be kept for long once picked. So, people learned to pickle them in vinegar, or ferment them into more stable forms. Apples, for instance, could be stored for months in cool, dry cellars if handled carefully. Root vegetables like turnips and carrots might be buried in sand or stored underground to keep them fresh. Grains, meanwhile, were the true lifeblood of medieval sustenance. Wheat, barley, oats, all needed careful drying and safe storage to prevent mold or infestations of pests. Properly stored grain could feed entire villages through harsh winters and failed harvests. Milk was perhaps the most fragile of all. Warm and full of nutrients, it spoiled within hours. The answer? Transform it immediately into butter or cheese, products that could last for weeks, months, or even years. In this way, perishable milk became durable, portable nutrition. It wasn't only about technique. The medieval world adapted its entire diet around the limits of preservation. Foods we now take for granted, fresh salads, tropical fruits, chilled desserts, were either entirely unknown or reserved for the wealthiest elites. Most people ate what could be stored and lasted: porridge, bread, dried legumes, smoked meats, and preserved fruits. Seasons governed everything. In spring, fresh greens were a delight after months of dried or salted fare. Summer brought berries and fresh produce. Autumn was the season of hard labor, preserving as much as possible for the lean months ahead. And winter was the great test, months where nothing grew, and survival depended entirely on what had been wisely stored. But even the best methods had limits. Spoilage still occurred. Rodents could invade stores. Insects might infest grains. A damp cellar could breed mold. Entire stocks of food might be lost unexpectedly, leading to hunger and desperation. When preservation failed, people fell back on foraging, hunting, or trading. Wild berries, mushrooms, and herbs supplemented diets. In times of great scarcity, people resorted to less desirable options, acorns, wild roots, and, in extreme cases, even famine foods that barely provided sustenance. It is easy to forget how fragile survival could be. A single bad harvest, an unseasonably warm winter that ruined ice storage, or a failed salt shipment, could tip the balance from sufficiency to hunger. Communities often came together to share what they had, but there were limits even to generosity. The nobility had some advantages. Wealthy estates sometimes built elaborate ice houses, deep, insulated pits where winter snow was packed and stored, sometimes lasting well into summer. But these luxuries were rare and costly. Most people never saw ice in the warmer months. And yet, despite these challenges, people found comfort and even joy in their meals. The family table was a place of gathering and storytelling. Even a simple meal of bread and cheese could become a cherished ritual, accompanied by ale brewed just weeks before. The scarcity of variety often made seasonal foods all the more special. Festivals and feasts punctuated the calendar, marking times of abundance with communal meals. A well-preserved ham, a rare barrel of wine, a carefully stored wheel of cheese, all became reasons for celebration. The medieval relationship with food was deeply personal, intimate, and tied to the land. Every preserved ham, every salted fish, every jar of pickles represented knowledge, effort, and hope for the future. In many ways, the lack of refrigeration made people more attuned to nature's cycles than we are today. And so, as we step back into the medieval world, we begin our exploration of the many ingenious ways people survived without the humming comfort of the refrigerator. The journey ahead will take us through smoky kitchens, cool cellars, and bustling marketplaces. We will meet the salted meats, the pickled vegetables, the aged cheeses, and the fermented brews that stood between families and starvation. This was life without cold storage. A constant battle with time and decay. A quiet, patient mastery of nature's limits. And in its own way, it was beautiful. The medieval world moved to the slow, steady beat of the seasons. Unlike our modern lives, where climate-controlled buildings and 24-hour supermarkets separate us from nature's cycles, people of the Middle Ages lived intimately tied to the turning of the earth. The seasons were not just markers of time. They were the rulers of survival. Every season brought its own tasks, its own anxieties, and its own opportunities. Each change in weather signaled a shift in daily life. Spring meant hope and renewal. Summer demanded hard labor. Autumn called for careful planning. And winter tested everything that had come before. In spring, the world awakened from its long, cold sleep. The air grew softer. The ground thawed. Farmers returned to their fields, pushing seeds into the damp soil. Budding trees signaled the return of fresh leaves, and the promise of fruit. This was a season of cautious optimism. Food stores from the previous year would often be at their lowest point by spring. The salted meat barrels were nearly empty. The dried beans dwindled. Bread made from stored grain might be thinner, coarser, stretched with whatever filler could be found. But as the days lengthened, nature began to offer its first gifts once more. Early greens were eagerly gathered, wild garlic, nettles, dandelion leaves. These small offerings were not only fresh and flavorful, they provided essential nutrients that had been missing for months. After a winter of salted and dried fare, these first greens were a kind of medicine, refreshing both body and spirit. Spring also marked the beginning of the dairy season. Animals that had birthed young, cows, goats, sheep, produced fresh milk once more. This abundance of milk was quickly transformed into cheese and butter, as fresh milk could spoil in a matter of hours without refrigeration. But spring was brief. Summer arrived with its relentless demands. The days grew long, the sun intense. This was the season of labor. Fields had to be tended, crops weeded, hay harvested. Orchards watched carefully as fruit ripened beneath the warming sun. Summer also offered its share of fresh food, berries, peas, young vegetables. Families enjoyed brief moments of plenty, knowing that most of this bounty could not be stored long in its fresh state. Preserving began almost immediately. Fruits were dried in the sun or cooked into thick, sweet preserves that could last through winter. Meats, when available, were salted or smoked. Herbs were gathered and hung in cool, dry places to cure. The entire household participated in this work. Summer's warmth also accelerated spoilage. Without cool storage, food left unattended could rot in a single afternoon. Insects swarmed. Rodents prowled. Great care was taken to protect valuable food stores from these constant threats. As the sun began to lower earlier in the sky, autumn arrived, the most critical season of all. This was the season of harvest, of gathering, of preparing for the long sleep of winter. Fields of wheat and barley were cut and bundled. Grains were dried carefully to prevent mold, and stored in bins or barrels. Vegetables like carrots, onions, and turnips were pulled from the ground and layered into cellars, sometimes cushioned in sand or straw. Fruit trees offered their final gifts: apples, pears, plums, many of which could be stored whole in cool, dark places if the conditions were right. Others were preserved through drying, fermenting, or boiling into thick pastes and jams. Livestock were often culled in autumn as well. It was costly to feed animals through winter, when fresh forage was scarce. Excess animals were slaughtered, and their meat preserved for the cold months ahead. Smoke houses filled with curing hams and sausages. Root cellars were carefully inspected. Barrels of salted fish were topped off. Casks of ale and wine were sealed. Honey was gathered and stored. Everything was counted, measured, and guarded, for the coming months would allow no second chance. Winter was the season of waiting. The world outside grew cold and still. Snow blanketed fields and forests. The ground hardened. Nothing new would grow until the world turned again toward spring. During winter, families withdrew into the shelter of their homes. Fires were kept burning, both for warmth and cooking. Meals were simple but carefully rationed. Salted meats were soaked to remove some of their brine. Dried beans and grains were boiled into thick stews. Pickled vegetables offered a tart, flavorful contrast to the heavy fare. Even in winter, preservation continued. The cold allowed certain foods to keep longer, though cellars still had to be monitored for dampness and mold. If the weather was mild, some spoilage was inevitable. A harsh winter could preserve better, but might also threaten the people themselves. Winter was a season of careful management. Nothing could be wasted. Even spoiled grains might be fed to livestock or repurposed as compost. Every decision mattered. And as the sun finally began to linger longer in the sky, as snow melted and buds appeared once more, the cycle would begin again. Each year was a quiet contest between preparation and nature's unpredictability. The rhythm of nature ruled not only what was eaten, but when and how. Entire cuisines developed from these patterns. The hearty stews, the heavy breads, the smoked meats, these were born from necessity. Seasonal festivals, like harvest feasts or midwinter celebrations, were not only social events, but moments of profound relief that the stores had lasted another season. In modern times, we barely notice when strawberries are suddenly available in January or tropical fruits arrive at distant markets. Refrigerated ships, airplanes, and climate-controlled warehouses have broken the old cycles. But in medieval times, the natural rhythm remained absolute. The people of that era lived with constant awareness of time's passage. They watched the sky, felt the changing air, smelled the fresh earth thawing, or the cold frost settling in. Their very lives were synchronized with nature's endless loop. And while it may seem fragile to us, this way of life created a deep knowledge of the land and its gifts. The rhythm of nature was not just a rule, it was a quiet partner, guiding daily life, whispering through the seasons. As we continue our gentle journey through the world of medieval food preservation, we will explore the tools and wisdom that people used to preserve their precious harvests. In the next chapter, we will venture into the world of salt, tiny white crystals that became one of the most powerful allies in the fight against spoilage. The art of salting, preserving meat and fish for long, uncertain months ahead. In a world without refrigeration, meat was both precious and perilous. It offered rich sustenance, yet it spoiled with alarming speed. Within mere days, or even hours in warm weather, fresh meat would turn sour, dangerous, and inedible. The medieval household, ever watchful, had to act swiftly to preserve what could not be immediately consumed. Among the many preservation methods discovered over the centuries, none was more vital or more universally practiced than salting. This simple, humble mineral, sodium chloride, became one of humanity's oldest and most effective defenses against food spoilage. The science behind it was not fully understood by medieval people, but its results were undeniable. Salt draws moisture out of food. Without moisture, bacteria struggle to survive. And with fewer bacteria, food resists decay. Long before microscopes revealed the world of microbes, people knew that a properly salted piece of meat or fish would last far longer than its fresh counterpart. But salt was not always easy to come by. In coastal areas, salt could be harvested from evaporated seawater, collected in great shallow pans, where sun and wine performed their quiet work. Inland, salt often came from mines, ancient deposits left behind by long-vanished seas. These salt mines, like those at Wieliczka in Poland or Hallstatt in Austria, became centers of trade, wealth, and power. Transporting salt was a laborious and expensive affair. Pack animals trudged across great distances, their burdens heavy with the crystalline treasure. Rivers carried boats laden with salt downstream toward eager markets. In some regions, salt was so valuable that it was used in barter or even as currency, a practice that gives us the word salary, rooted in the Latin word salarium. When salt reached the household, it was guarded carefully. And when the time came to preserve meat or fish, the process was almost ceremonial in its care and precision. Let us imagine a small medieval village in late autumn. The air is crisp, the fields are bare, and preparations for winter are in full motion. A pig has been slaughtered, its meat freshly butchered and laid out on wooden tables. Family members gather in the cool air, working swiftly. First, the meat is trimmed of excess fat and blood. Too much moisture invites spoilage. Large cuts, hams, shoulders, slabs of bacon, are rubbed generously with coarse salt. Sometimes, a mixture of salt and spices might be used, depending on what is available. The salted meat is then packed tightly into barrels or wooden troughs. As the days pass, the salt pulls liquid from the flesh, creating a salty brine that submerges the meat entirely. This brine, rich and potent, continues the preservation process, discouraging the growth of bacteria. For several weeks, the meat rests in its salty bath. Each day, it is checked, turned, and sometimes resalted if necessary. Eventually, the meat becomes firm, dense, and safe for long-term storage. Once fully cured, it can be hung in a cool, dry place, often alongside smoked meats, where it will last for many months. Fish, too, was treated with salt, though the process could vary depending on the species and the climate. In coastal towns, entire industries grew up around salted fish. Cod, herring, and anchovies were among the most commonly preserved. In places like Scandinavia or the Basque Country, fishermen hauled their catches ashore, where waiting crews cleaned, split, and salted the fish within hours. The salted fish were stacked in layers, pressed to remove excess liquid, and sometimes dried afterward for even greater longevity. Salt cod, in particular, became a staple that could last for years and be shipped across vast distances. Salted fish fed sailors on long voyages, monks in remote monasteries, and peasants far from the sea. Its portability and durability made it a medieval marvel. Of course, salted food tasted quite different from fresh. Heavily salted meats and fish had a dense, chewy texture and an intense, sometimes overpowering saltiness. Before eating, the food was often soaked in fresh water to draw out some of the salt. This soaking process could take many hours or even days. But while the flavor may not have matched fresh fare, salted meats and fish offered a crucial source of protein during long winters, when hunting was scarce, and gardens lay dormant under snow. They also carried an added measure of security. Even in times of crisis, famine, war, or plague, salted stores might sustain life when little else could be found. Salting was not only a household task, it was an entire industry. In port cities, salters worked alongside fishermen, processing vast quantities of fish for export. Inland, butchers and merchants specialized in curing hams and preserving bacon for urban markets. Monasteries often became centers of expertise, refining salting methods, experimenting with new mixtures of herbs and spices, and recording their knowledge for future generations. The importance of salt was so great that wars were fought over access to it. Salt taxes, often called the gabelle in medieval France, became a major source of revenue for monarchs, but also a heavy burden on common folk. Smugglers risked severe punishment to trade in untaxed salt, moving it secretly across borders to supply villages and towns. Despite the difficulties, salting remained one of the few universally available ways to preserve meat and fish for extended periods. It was adaptable, effective, and relatively simple to teach. Even the poorest households might manage to secure a small supply of salt to protect their most valuable foodstuffs. In this way, salt became much more than a seasoning. It was a guardian of survival, a silent partner in the unending struggle against time and decay. With its crystals packed carefully around cuts of meat or layers of fish, salt held back the ruin that lurked in every warm breeze and humid cellar. Even today, the legacy of medieval salting endures. Traditional cured hams, salted bacons, and preserved fish remain culinary treasures, their flavors shaped by ancient necessity. Though we now enjoy refrigeration, these foods offer a quiet reminder of the ingenuity that once kept entire communities fed through long, uncertain winters. In the quiet villages and bustling towns of medieval Europe, another ally joined salt in the age-old battle against spoilage. That ally was smoke. Long before the chemistry of preservation was understood, people discovered that the fragrant curls of wood smoke, drifting from their fires, could do far more than simply warm their homes. Smoke, rich with natural compounds, could help preserve meat, add complex flavors, and guard against decay. Thus, the smokehouse was born, a humble but vital structure in the medieval landscape. The smokehouse was often a small, stout building set slightly apart from the main home or farmstead. Its thick stone or timber walls trapped the smoke, while tiny vents allowed just enough airflow to control the smoldering fires within. Inside, beams and racks hung heavy with cuts of meat, slowly absorbing the dark, curling plumes that rose from carefully tended embers. Smoke preservation worked by several methods at once. First, the heat from the smoke gently dried the surface of the meat, lowering its moisture content, a crucial factor in preventing the growth of bacteria. Second, the smoke itself contained natural chemicals like formaldehyde, phenols, and acids that acted as mild disinfectants. These compounds created an environment hostile to many of the microscopic invaders that could cause rot. The process of smoking meat was slow, deliberate, and deeply rooted in the rhythm of the seasons. Much like salting, smoking was often performed in the cooler months of autumn, after the livestock culling had provided fresh cuts ready for preservation. The cool air helped prevent spoilage during the initial preparation stages, and the steady chill allowed the smoke to work its magic without cooking the meat. Before the meat ever entered the smokehouse, it was often first salted, or brined. This two-step approach provided maximum protection. The salt drew out moisture and inhibited bacterial growth, while the smoke layered on additional defenses and flavor. Once sufficiently salted, the meat was rinsed and patted dry, then hung or laid on racks within the smokehouse. The choice of wood was critical. Different trees produced different flavors and smoking qualities. Hardwoods like oak, beech, hickory, and maple were favored for their steady, clean burning nature and the rich, pleasant flavors they imparted. Softer woods, resinous pines, or greenwood were avoided, as their smoke could be harsh, acrid, or even toxic. The fire itself was kept low and steady, producing not roaring flames but slow, smoldering embers. A skilled smokehouse keeper watched the fire constantly, adding wood in careful increments to maintain a consistent temperature and flow of smoke. Too much heat could cook the meat prematurely, too little might leave it vulnerable to spoilage. The length of smoking varied depending on the type and thickness of the meat. Thin cuts like bacon or fish might require only a few days, while larger hams and shoulders could hang for weeks. Throughout this time, the smoke gently infused the flesh, creating a rich, reddish hue on the surface and a deep, savory aroma that signaled its growing resilience against time. Inside the smokehouse, the atmosphere was calm but intense. The air was thick and aromatic. Hanging rows of meat swayed gently as drafts of smoke curled around them, their glistening surfaces slowly transforming. The keeper, wrapped in thick garments to guard against the chill and smoke, moved with care, tending the fire, adjusting vents, and checking the progress of the preservation. For the medieval household, the smokehouse was a place of security. As the smoked meats accumulated on their hooks, families knew they were laying up precious stores that could see them through the harsh months ahead. Each ham, each slab of bacon, was a promise of nourishment when fields lay barren and the cold wind howled. Beyond mere practicality, smoking also created distinct flavors that became cherished traditions in different regions. In Germany, smoked sausages like bratwurst and metwurst developed their unique characters. In England, smoked hams and kippers became culinary staples. Across Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, smoked fish and meats filled larders and market stalls, their rich flavors woven into daily life and festive feasts alike. Even when fresh meat was available, smoked meats often held a place of honor on the table. Their robust taste and long shelf life made them ideal for travel, trade, and gifts. Merchants carried smoked delicacies along trade routes, introducing distant regions to new flavors and techniques. The smokehouse itself often reflected the ingenuity of local builders. Some were simple wooden huts with dirt floors and thatched roofs. Others were more elaborate stone structures with specially designed chimneys and ventilation systems. In some larger estates or monasteries, the smokehouse was part of a broader complex of food storage buildings, granaries, dairies, and cellars, each playing its role in the intricate dance of medieval survival. But no matter the size or design, the smokehouse always stood as a quiet, fragrant guardian of the community's winter hopes. It was a place where patience met knowledge, where ancient wisdom was practiced daily without fanfare. Generations passed down their smoking secrets: how much salt to use, how to select wood, how to balance time and temperature. Though modern technology has long since replaced the smokehouse in most places, echoes of its quiet importance still linger. We still prize smoked foods for their unique tastes. Artisan smokehouses operate today much as they did centuries ago, offering cured meats and fish that honor the same principles, discovered by medieval villagers standing beside their smoldering fires. In that way, the medieval smokehouse offers us not only a glimpse into the struggle for preservation but also into the timeless appreciation for flavor, craftsmanship, and tradition. Each smoky slice of ham, each savory bite of bacon, whispers of centuries past, of long winters faced with resolve, of resourceful hands at work, and of the enduring partnership between humans and nature's quiet tools. And so, with the warmth of the smokehouse still lingering in our minds, we will next turn our attention to another vital tool of survival, the art of drying and dehydration, a method both simple and profound, capable of turning fresh harvests into durable winter stores. In the next chapter, we explore drying and dehydration, harnessing air and sunlight, a gentle craft that extended life to fruits, vegetables, and grains. In the medieval world, simplicity often hid great wisdom. Among all the methods of preserving food without refrigeration, perhaps none was more ancient, more intuitive, or more widespread than the humble act of drying. Long before people discovered the powers of salt and smoke, they understood that air and sunlight could work wonders to prolong the life of food. Drying, or dehydration, is based on a principle as old as life itself. Moisture invites decay. Water gives bacteria, molds, and yeasts the environment they need to multiply. Remove the moisture, and you strip these microscopic threats of their power. What remains is food that is safe, compact, and capable of lasting for months, or even years, if carefully stored. In every corner of the medieval world, people developed their own drying methods, shaped by climate, tradition, and the nature of the food they sought to preserve. In warmer southern regions, the hot sun and dry air made natural dehydration relatively easy. In cooler northern lands, where humidity and rain could complicate the process, ingenious drying sheds and indoor hearth setups compensated for the lack of reliable weather. Fruits were among the most commonly dried foods. Apples, pears, plums, apricots, figs, and grapes offered sweet relief during harvest season, but their freshness was fleeting. Without preservation, they would rot within days or weeks. But once sliced, laid upon wicker trays or linen cloths, and exposed to the warm embrace of the sun, these fruits slowly surrendered their moisture. Their sugars concentrated, their flesh shriveled, and they transformed into chewy, flavorful morsels that could be enjoyed deep into winter. The transformation of grapes into raisins, or plums into prunes, was not only practical but delightful. These dried fruits became treats for children, ingredients in savory stews, and components of festival breads and pastries. Monasteries, often centers of agricultural knowledge, excelled in perfecting drying techniques, experimenting with different varieties and methods to achieve the best results. Beyond fruits, vegetables also lent themselves to drying. Peas, beans, lentils, and other legumes were frequently left to mature on the vine, allowing nature to dry them before harvest. Once gathered, they were carefully shelled, sorted, and stored in cool, dry places. These dried pulses formed a cornerstone of the medieval diet, providing essential protein and nourishment throughout the lean months. Leafy greens and herbs, while more fragile, were also dried for later use. Bundles of sage, thyme, rosemary, and mint hung from wooden beams, their fragrant oils preserved within the shriveled leaves. These herbs flavored broths, stews, and medicines alike, offering both comfort and remedy as winter's grip tightened. Grains, too, benefited from drying. Wheat, barley, oats, and rye were harvested and carefully dried in the fields or in barns before storage. Moist grain could spoil rapidly, growing mold or fermenting into ruin. Drying ensured that these vital stores remained viable for grinding into flour or boiling into hearty porridges for months ahead. Even meat and fish could be dried, though the process required more careful handling than fruits or grains. Thin strips of meat, often from game or lesser cuts, were hung in well-ventilated sheds or near warm hearths, protected from insects and scavengers. The slow circulation of air, combined with moderate warmth, gradually leached out moisture, producing dried meat akin to what we might today call jerky. In coastal regions, fish drying became a major industry. The Norwegians and Icelanders perfected the drying of cod, creating stockfish, whole fish stiffened by months of wind and cold, their water content almost entirely gone. These dried fish could survive years of storage and long voyages, feeding merchants, sailors, and soldiers far from home. Unlike salting and smoking, which often altered the flavor dramatically, drying allowed many foods to retain much of their original taste, simply concentrated and intensified. A dried apple slice still carried the sweetness of autumn's harvest, dried peas still swelled into soft nourishment when boiled into pottage. Yet drying was not without its risks. The process depended heavily on favorable weather, clean air, and careful handling. Rain or high humidity could cause spoilage. Insects and rodents constantly threatened unattended, drying racks. And even after drying was complete, improper storage could allow moisture to return, inviting rot or infestation. To guard against these dangers, medieval people developed many small but effective safeguards. Food was often dried under protective coverings, thin linen cloths or screens, to keep pests at bay. Drying structures were sometimes elevated or enclosed to shield the contents from rain. And once dried, foods were stored in tightly sealed containers, wooden barrels, earthenware jars, or cloth sacks, kept in cool, dry cellars where the air remained still and dampness was minimal. One of the great advantages of dried foods was their portability. Light in weight, resistant to spoilage, and compact, they could be carried easily over long distances. Merchants packed dried fruits, grains, and pulses into their carts for trade across the continent. Pilgrims and soldiers filled their packs with dried provisions for long journeys. Even the smallest peasant household could prepare bundles of dried herbs and vegetables to barter or store away. In times of war, famine, or harsh winters, these dried stores became lifelines. They allowed families to stretch their meager resources to prepare simple but sustaining meals when fresh ingredients were nowhere to be found. A handful of dried beans, some salted pork, a few withered apples, together they could become a hearty stew that warded off hunger and kept bodies strong. Beyond simple sustenance, dried foods also played a role in medieval medicine. Dried herbs were essential ingredients in countless remedies, poultices, and tonics. Apothecaries carefully dried and ground plants like chamomile, lavender, or horehound, preserving their healing properties for use throughout the year. In this way, the art of drying bridged both the kitchen and the infirmary. And still, despite its age and simplicity, drying remained a skill requiring attention, patience, and knowledge. Experienced hands knew just how much sun a batch of apples needed, how to protect herbs from mildew, how to store dried peas so that weevils could not invade. In many ways, drying was not merely a technique, but a quiet dialogue between people and nature, a conversation held across generations. Today, as we enjoy the convenience of modern refrigeration, the ancient craft of drying still endures in many corners of the world. We find echoes of medieval wisdom in the dried fruits on our shelves, the herbs in our kitchens, and the grains stored safely in silos. Even in an age of abundance, the lessons of careful preparation, simple tools, and respect for the rhythms of nature continue to serve us. And so, from the sun-dappled orchards to the shaded drying sheds, we see how air and light offered medieval people one more defense against the ever-present threat of hunger. In the next chapter of our quiet journey, we will enter the cool, dark world of medieval root cellars and underground storage, a realm where clever design and careful insulation protected precious stores through the long winter months. While medieval people turned to salt, smoke, and drying to preserve many of their foods, they also knew how to harness the quiet power of the earth itself. Beneath the soil lay a steady, cool refuge, a place where temperature fluctuations were softened, where sunlight could not reach to spoil or heat, and where food could quietly endure the passage of weeks and months. These were the medieval cellars and underground storage spaces, often as essential to survival as the fields that grew the crops. The principle was simple. Even in the heat of summer or the cold of winter, the temperature just a few feet underground remains relatively stable. Where above ground temperatures might swing wildly, dipping below freezing or rising unbearably high, the Earth's embrace kept cellars comfortably cool, usually hovering between 40 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit. This stable, cool environment significantly slowed the growth of bacteria and fungi, protecting food from rapid spoilage. Every village and homestead, from the poorest peasant hut to the wealthiest manor, relied on some form of underground storage. For some, it was a simple pit dug into the ground, lined with straw, leaves, or wooden planks, and carefully covered to keep out moisture and pests. For others, it was a more elaborate stone cellar, built beneath the house or freestanding nearby, with thick walls that kept out both heat and invaders. In many towns and cities, communal storage spaces were developed, shared cellars beneath monasteries, inns, or merchant houses, where large stores of food, drink, and trade goods could be safely kept. These spaces were often dim, quiet, and cool year-round, a silent guardian of the community's wealth and sustenance. What, then, filled these underground chambers? Many of the items stored here could not be salted, smoked, or dried without losing their nature. Root vegetables, such as carrots, parsnips, turnips, beets, and radishes, were perfect candidates. These hardy crops, pulled from the earth at harvest, were often packed in layers of sand or straw to prevent rot and retain moisture. In this way, they could remain edible deep into winter. Cabbages and other leafy vegetables were also carefully stored, sometimes hung from the ceiling to keep them dry and cool. Apples and pears were nestled in crates, cushioned to prevent bruising, while nuts and grains were sealed tightly to prevent infestation. The cellar became a kind of quiet pantry, each item placed with care and understanding of its particular needs. In wealthier households, the cellar served not only for food but also for drink. Barrels of ale, mead, cider, and wine were kept here, their delicate fermentation processes benefiting from the consistent temperatures. Cheese wheels aged in the cool dark, their rinds hardening, their flavors maturing into rich complexity. Even fresh milk, though it could not last long, might be kept for an extra day or two, in the cellar's embrace, bought precious hours before turning sour. The medieval cellar was not only a storage space, but also a place of constant care and vigilance. Spoilage, rodents, and mold were ever-present threats. Regular inspections were vital. Housewives and servants checked barrels for leaks, turned apples to prevent bruising from resting too long on one side, and carefully sifted through grain stores for signs of moisture or infestation. Insects and rodents posed constant hazards. Mice could slip through the tiniest cracks, nibbling at stored grains or fruits. Weevils might infest bags of flour. Mold could silently creep across cheeses or root vegetables. The constant labor of monitoring, cleaning, and reorganizing the cellar became a seasonal rhythm, often passed down through generations as a vital household skill. Despite these challenges, the benefits of underground storage were profound. When winter snows covered the fields and markets offered little but salted or dried fare, the cellar provided variety. A stew enriched with carrots and turnips from the cellar, thickened with stored grain, and flavored with dried herbs might be the difference between meager survival and relative comfort. In regions with harsher winters, underground storage became even more sophisticated. Some northern cultures developed ice cellars, where blocks of ice harvested from frozen rivers and lakes were packed in sawdust or straw and stored underground. These icy reserves allowed for rudimentary refrigeration, extending the life of more delicate items even into the warmer months. The role of the cellar extended beyond mere food storage, touching the social and cultural lives of medieval people as well. In monasteries, careful records were kept of what was stored below: how many barrels of wine, how much salted pork, how many bushels of grain remained. In wealthy manors, the steward or cellarer oversaw these stores, managing them as part of the estate's wealth. The cellar was also a place of refuge in times of siege or famine. When enemies threatened, or when crops failed, the stores laid up beneath the earth offered a buffer against starvation. Every sack of grain, every jar of honey, every barrel of ale represented not just sustenance, but hope. Even in smaller peasant households, the cellar stood as a quiet reminder of the family's foresight and labor. The work of harvesting, storing, and maintaining these supplies was as vital as planting the fields. It reflected not only the rhythms of nature but also the rhythms of family life, the annual dance of preparation and preservation that marked each turning season. As time wore on and medieval knowledge deepened, some cellars became quite sophisticated. Drainage systems were added to keep out groundwater. Airflow was carefully controlled with vents and grates. Separate chambers might be designated for grains, fruits, dairy, or meats. In the grandest estates, these spaces grew into vast underground labyrinths, humming with quiet industry as servants moved about, maintaining the supplies. Today, the art of underground storage still lingers in certain traditions. Root cellars remain in use in some rural areas, valued for their efficiency and simplicity. Modern wine cellars trace their lineage directly to these medieval predecessors. And even in our technologically advanced age, the cool, dark earth continues to offer its gentle service. The medieval cellar stands as a testament to human ingenuity and adaptability, a silent partner in survival, offering its quiet embrace through centuries of uncertainty. As we leave the cool depths of these underground sanctuaries, We now turn our gaze toward the bustling world of markets and seasonal cycles, how communities came together to share, barter, and trade food that might otherwise spoil if kept too long. In the medieval world, survival was not a solitary pursuit. While the cellar, the smokehouse, the salting vat, and the drying racks each played their parts in preserving food within the home, much of a family's diet still depended upon a broader network of exchange, community, and careful timing. This was the world of markets and seasonal eating, a world where the rhythms of nature and commerce intertwined, offering moments of abundance and periods of scarcity. Medieval people lived by the seasons. The turning of the year was not marked by clocks or calendars so much as by the ripening of fruits, the readiness of grains, and the migration of animals. Each season brought its own gifts and its own dangers. To thrive, one had to know not only how to preserve food, but when it would be available, how long it would last, and what risks lay ahead before the next harvest. Spring was a time of hope but also vulnerability. The stores of the previous year had often dwindled dangerously low by late winter, a time sometimes called the hungry gap. As fresh greens like nettles, wild garlic, and young lettuce emerged, they brought much-needed vitamins to a weary population, but substantial food, grains, meats, fruits, remained scarce until summer and autumn. Summer and autumn, by contrast, were seasons of bustling activity. Fields ripened with wheat and barley. Orchards hung heavy with apples, pears, and plums. Gardens overflowed with beans, cabbages, onions, and herbs. This was the time of both labor and opportunity, the moment to gather, preserve, and trade. Markets sprang to life in towns and villages. On market days, peasants, merchants, and artisans gathered to sell their surplus and purchase what they could not produce themselves. The sights, sounds, and smells of the market were a vivid contrast to the quiet labors of preservation at home. Stalls groaned under piles of fresh produce, cheeses, meats, fish, and baked goods. Traders shouted their wares while buyers haggled for better prices. For many people, the market was essential not just for variety but for survival. A family that had failed to harvest enough grain might barter salted pork or dried fruit for additional flour. A fisherman might trade his catch for fresh vegetables from inland farms. Even in largely self-sufficient villages, few households could produce everything they needed year-round. The role of the market extended beyond food. Seeds for planting, tools for farming, salt for preserving, and cloth for storing dried goods were all exchanged here. It was a place of knowledge as well, where news of better preservation techniques, new crop varieties, or distant famines spread quickly through conversation. Yet the abundance of the market was always tempered by the knowledge of winter's approach. Families bought or traded not simply for present meals but for future security. Extra grain was sealed in barrels. Dried beans were stashed away. Apples were carefully wrapped and stored. Each purchase was an act of foresight, a wager against the uncertainty of the coming months. In years of good harvests, markets overflowed, and even the poor could find enough to eat. Prices fell, and trading was lively. But in years of poor weather, crop failure, or plague, scarcity returned swiftly. Prices rose sharply. Some foods disappeared entirely. Wealthier households might weather the storm by drawing on their deeper stores, but poorer families faced real danger. The church played a role in seasonal eating as well. Religious calendars dictated long periods of fasting, particularly during Lent, Advent, and numerous saints' days. On fast days, meat, dairy, and eggs were forbidden, shifting diets toward grains, legumes, vegetables, and preserved fish. These religious restrictions indirectly encouraged more diversified preservation methods. Salting and drying fish, for example, became essential industries precisely because of fasting regulations. Feast days, by contrast, were moments of joyful indulgence. Weddings, harvest festivals, religious celebrations, and major holidays saw tables piled high with foods that might normally be rationed carefully. Roasted meats, fresh breads, cheeses, pies filled with dried fruits, and rich spiced wines turned the market's bounty into brief but memorable extravagance. In the countryside, Itinerant merchants played a crucial role in bridging isolated communities. Traveling peddlers moved from village to village, bringing salt from distant coasts, exotic spices from trade routes, and preserved goods like smoked fish or dried fruits that were otherwise difficult to obtain locally. These traders were lifelines, especially for small villages far from major markets. Seasonality shaped not just what was eaten but how it was prepared. In the bountiful months, fresh vegetables appeared daily on the table, while fresh dairy products like soft cheeses and fresh milk were more abundant. But as winter deepened, the meals grew heavier, built from stored grains, dried legumes, salted meats, and carefully rationed preserves. The art of seasonal eating was also one of careful balance. One could not consume too much of the fresh harvest, lest there be nothing left for winter. Nor could one preserve everything successfully. Some items spoiled sooner than expected. Rats or weevils could compromise grain stores. A misjudged barrel of salted fish might turn rancid. Every decision carried the weight of both hope and risk. Through these cycles of feast and famine, community ties grew strong. Neighbors might share surplus during good years, and assist one another during lean times. Lords and monasteries, while not always charitable, often provided grain or alms during local famines, both as an act of piety and a means of preserving social stability. Even in cities, where markets were more stable, seasons ruled. Butchers closed during summer when the heat made fresh meat risky. Fishmongers offered dried or salted options when the rivers froze. Bakers adjusted their recipes based on the year's grain supply. Each profession adapted in quiet rhythm with nature's changes. The medieval market, for all its color and noise, was ultimately a fragile balance. A few weeks of poor weather could tip communities into hunger. A bountiful harvest, conversely, could lift an entire village into prosperity. Always, the specter of scarcity loomed, reminding each generation of the delicate thread upon which their survival hung. Yet through careful preparation, communal exchange, and deep respect for the seasons, medieval people endured. Their markets were more than places of trade, they were centers of life, where knowledge, goods, and hope were exchanged daily. As we leave the noisy stalls and crowded streets behind, our next chapter will take us into one of the more unusual forms of medieval preservation, fermentation and pickling, controlled rot as an ally. There, we will discover how even the processes of decay could be turned into powerful tools for extending the life of food. In a world without refrigeration, where heat, moisture, and time constantly conspired to spoil food, medieval people discovered an unlikely friend in one of nature's most curious processes, fermentation. Where unchecked rot would bring decay and sickness, carefully guided fermentation turned that same decay into safety, nourishment, and sometimes even pleasure. Pickling, brining, brewing, and fermenting became arts passed down through generations, a quiet mastery of controlled transformation. At first glance, fermentation can seem strange and even unsettling. It is, after all, the deliberate encouragement of microbial activity in food, allowing bacteria, yeasts, and molds to change its flavor, texture, and composition. But unlike uncontrolled spoilage, which makes food dangerous, controlled fermentation creates acids, alcohols, and gases that preserve food by making it inhospitable to harmful organisms. In effect, it is a kind of microbial battle where friendly microbes are enlisted to keep the dangerous ones at bay. One of the most widespread forms of fermentation was the making of sourdough bread. Without modern yeast packets, medieval bakers relied on wild yeasts floating in the air or clinging to the grains themselves. A simple mixture of flour and water, left exposed, would naturally attract these wild yeasts and begin to ferment, bubbling gently as gases formed. This starter culture could be fed and maintained for years, even generations, providing leavening for daily bread. The slightly tangy flavor of sourdough was not a luxury but the natural taste of survival bread across much of Europe. Dairy, too, lent itself well to fermentation. Fresh milk spoiled rapidly, especially in warmer climates, but medieval people transformed milk into cheese, yogurt, and cultured butter. Cheese making, in particular, was both science and art. Through careful curdling, salting, and aging, milk was converted into a durable, transportable, and highly nutritious food that could last for months or even years. Different regions developed their own unique cheeses, shaped by local microbial life, climate, and traditions. Perhaps the most universally recognized form of fermentation was alcohol. Medieval people were experts at brewing and fermenting, not merely for enjoyment but for safety. Water, especially in towns and cities, was often unsafe to drink due to contamination. Beer, ale, mead, cider, and wine offered safer alternatives, as the fermentation process killed many harmful pathogens. Even children drank small beer, with very low alcohol content as part of their daily meals. Each of these beverages required its own expertise. Ale and beer relied on fermented grains, often barley, with added hops in later centuries for bitterness and preservation. Mead was made from honey, sometimes flavored with herbs and spices. Cider emerged in apple-rich regions, while wine flourished where grapes could be cultivated. These fermented drinks were central not just to diet but to social life, ritual, and even medicine. Beyond fermentation, pickling offered another avenue for preservation. Vegetables like cucumbers, onions, beets, and cabbages were immersed in solutions of brine or vinegar, creating an acidic environment hostile to spoilage organisms. Pickling extended the life of garden, produce well into the winter months, adding vital variety to the otherwise heavy, salted winter diet. Pickled foods were common at every level of society. In noble halls, elaborate pickled dishes might accompany feasts, offering sharp, tangy contrasts to heavy meats. In peasant cottages, simple crocks of pickled turnips or cabbage provided crucial vitamins when fresh produce was scarce. Sauerkraut, fermented cabbage, became a staple in many parts of Europe, valued for its longevity and its ability to prevent scurvy. The process of pickling was simple in theory but required care in practice. Vegetables had to be fresh and free of blemishes. The brine had to be salty enough to discourage unwanted bacteria, but not so strong as to ruin the flavor. Weights were used to keep vegetables submerged, preventing mold from growing on the exposed surface. Like other preservation methods, pickling was an ongoing responsibility, requiring attention and occasional adjustment. Fermented and pickled foods offered more than just preservation, they brought important nutritional benefits. The acids produced during fermentation made certain nutrients more bioavailable. Beneficial bacteria aided digestion and promoted gut health, though medieval people lacked the modern vocabulary to explain these effects. They simply knew, through generations of experience, that fermented foods helped sustain them through long winters and poor harvests. Fermentation was not limited to Europe. Across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, ancient peoples developed rich traditions of fermenting soybeans into sauces, milk into yogurts, fish into pastes, and grains into sour porridges. Each culture, facing its own climate challenges, found in fermentation a universal solution to the problem of preservation. In monasteries, fermentation was elevated to a high art. Monks became master brewers and cheesemakers, developing techniques still prized today. Their cloisters often contained dedicated fermentation rooms, where temperature and humidity were carefully managed, and recipes were recorded with meticulous detail. The quiet bubbling of ale or the slow aging of cheese echoed the patient rhythms of monastic life itself. But even with all its benefits, fermentation was not without risks. A poorly fermented batch could produce dangerous toxins. Containers might crack or spoil. Off flavors or textures warned of failure, and entire stores could sometimes be lost. Knowledge passed down through careful observation was essential. Housewives, brewers, and farmers learned to read the subtle signs, a sour smell, a color change, a suspicious film, that indicated whether fermentation was succeeding or slipping toward rot. In many ways, fermentation and pickling represent the medieval world's willingness to work with nature, rather than against it. Instead of trying to halt all microbial life, they learned to guide it. They turned the natural processes of decay into tools of preservation, safety, and even celebration. As we leave the crocks, barrels, and bubbling vats behind, we begin to see that medieval food preservation was never about one method alone. It was a web of interconnected practices, each supporting the others. And so, in our next chapter, we will explore the role of animals and livestock, living food storage, where the very creatures around them became walking, breathing reserves of nourishment. In the grand puzzle of medieval survival without refrigeration, one of the most clever and natural solutions was to avoid storage altogether. Instead, people let their food walk, graze, and cluck around them. Animals, whether livestock or poultry, became not only sources of daily sustenance but also living, breathing storage units that preserved food safely in the form of flesh, milk, and eggs until the moment they were needed. In this way, medieval people relied on nature's own timing rather than rushing to preserve what they could not yet consume. The logic was simple but elegant. Fresh meat spoils quickly, but a live animal preserves it perfectly until slaughter. A cow or goat continues to produce milk as long as it is well fed. Chickens lay eggs almost daily, each egg naturally protected by its shell. Sheep provide not only wool for clothing but lamb for meat, when the time was right. As long as the animals thrived, so did the people who cared for them. Cows were among the most valuable animals for medieval families. They were treasured not only for their meat, which was usually reserved for special occasions, but for the steady supply of milk they provided. Milk, in turn, was transformed into butter and cheese, extending its usability far beyond its brief fresh state. A single cow could support a household's dairy needs for much of the year, provided it was healthy and properly managed. Goats served a similar purpose, especially in regions where pastureland was sparse. Their milk, rich and nutritious, was highly prized, and they required less space and feed than cattle. Goats also provided meat and hides, offering multiple layers of sustenance to families with limited resources. Chickens, ducks, and geese brought the daily miracle of eggs. Unlike fresh meat, which demanded immediate consumption or preservation, eggs arrived fresh nearly every day, offering protein and nutrients in a compact, naturally sealed package. During times of plenty, eggs could be traded, pickled, or even stored for brief periods under layers of lime water or ashes to extend their shelf life. Pigs were perhaps the most versatile animals in terms of food storage. Raised on kitchen scraps, acorns, and whatever forage they could find, pigs fattened quickly and provided an abundant source of meat. Unlike cattle, which were rarely slaughtered for routine meals, pigs were often butchered in autumn, when the cooling weather allowed for easier preservation. Their meat was salted, smoked, and dried, filling larders with bacon, ham, sausages, and fat for cooking. Almost every part of the pig could be used, a true example of medieval thrift. Sheep, too, offered multiple resources. While their wool was critical for clothing and trade, lamb and mutton provided meat when flocks were large enough to spare some animals. The timing of slaughter was carefully considered, balancing immediate needs against future breeding and wool production. In larger manors and estates, the variety and quantity of livestock could be staggering. Cattle herds roamed pastures, flocks of sheep dotted the hills, and pigsties bustled with activity. Poultry wandered the courtyards, while fish ponds stocked with carp or eels provided another layer of protein storage that didn't require salting or smoking. These estates managed their livestock not just for daily consumption, but as long-term investments in food security. The careful management of animals was a skill passed down through generations. Knowing when to breed, when to butcher, and how to care for each species was vital. Mistakes could lead to disease outbreaks, losses of entire herds, or dangerously low food supplies during winter. Medieval farmers watched for signs of illness, assisted in births, and carefully rationed feed to sustain animals through lean months. Seasons dictated much of this rhythm. Spring brought births and renewed milk supplies. Summer fattened animals on lush pastures. Autumn was slaughter season, timed so that preserved meats could last through the winter without the risk of spoilage in warmer months. Winter was a time of survival, where both humans and animals relied on careful preparations made during the previous seasons. In the monasteries, animal husbandry reached even greater refinement. Monks kept meticulous records of breeding lines, milk production, and butchering schedules. Their self-sufficient communities demonstrated how animal management could provide a reliable, ongoing food supply, even during times of external scarcity. The role of animals as living storage also extended to the community level. Wealthier landowners might lend animals to peasants under sharecropping or herding arrangements. In return, peasants provided a portion of milk, wool, or offspring back to the owner. This system allowed even the poor to access the benefits of livestock without the high cost of ownership. Livestock fairs and markets were also crucial. Farmers bought and sold animals not only for meat but for breeding, trade, and future security. These bustling events were filled with the lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, and the chatter of merchants negotiating deals that could determine a household's fortune for years. But as with every medieval solution, reliance on animals was not without its risks. Disease outbreaks like rinderpest or swine fever could decimate herds. Harsh winters might leave livestock starving or frozen. Bandits or invading armies sometimes raided farms, stealing or slaughtering animals, stripping families of their most valuable resources. Even so, the resilience of medieval communities often lay in their flexibility. If one preservation method failed, if salted meat spoiled, or grain ran low, there was often another layer of security in the animals that walked among them. The barnyard and pasture were not just scenes of daily life, they were living pantries, carefully tended against the uncertainties of nature and fate. As the medieval world spun on through its endless cycles of harvest and hunger, of preservation and peril, there was one rare and precious tool that, when available, offered remarkable relief from the struggle against spoilage: cold itself. While refrigeration as we know it lay centuries in the future, some medieval people found ways to capture nature's winter chill and extend its benefits deep into the warmer months. The practice of ice harvesting and early cooling techniques represents one of the most ingenious, yet laborious, chapters in the long story of food preservation. Unlike salting, smoking, or drying, which could be practiced almost anywhere with basic tools and knowledge, ice harvesting required specific conditions. Cold climates, accessible bodies of water, and secure storage facilities were all essential. For this reason, ice was a luxury for many, reserved mostly for nobility, monasteries, or well-resourced towns that could afford the effort and expense. The process began in the heart of winter, when ponds, lakes, and rivers froze solid under the weight of bitter cold. Skilled laborers ventured onto the frozen surfaces with axes, saws, and chisels. Working in teams, they carefully cut large, square blocks of ice, sometimes weighing hundreds of pounds each. These heavy blocks were then hauled from the water using ropes, sledges, or carts, often by horses or oxen straining against the weight. Each cut was precise. Too shallow, and the block would break apart. Too deep, and laborers risked falling into the freezing waters themselves, a deadly hazard in the biting cold. Experience and teamwork made the difference between a successful harvest and a dangerous disaster. Once extracted, the ice had to be transported quickly to its storage site before it began to melt. This destination was typically the ice house, a structure specifically designed to insulate and protect its precious contents for as long as possible. Medieval ice houses were often built partially underground, where the earth's cool temperatures offered a natural buffer against heat. Thick stone or brick walls, combined with thatched or turf roofs, provided further insulation. Inside, the ice blocks were stacked carefully, layer upon layer, with straw, sawdust, or even moss packed tightly between them. These materials not only prevented the ice from fusing together, but also absorbed any condensation that might accelerate melting. In a well-constructed ice house, blocks harvested in January might last into late summer or even early autumn, a remarkable feat in a world where preservation was a daily struggle. The ice itself was not typically used to freeze food directly, as we might use freezers today. Instead, it served to chill perishable items, particularly for the wealthy who could afford such luxury. Delicate fruits, fresh fish, dairy products, and rare delicacies could be stored for longer periods. maintaining their freshness far beyond what would normally be possible. In the grand kitchens of castles and manors, ice was also used to prepare chilled beverages, sorbets, and sweet confections that astonished guests and displayed the host's wealth and power. These frozen treats were rare and precious, enjoyed by only a select few, while most of the population relied on salted or dried fare. Ice harvesting was not limited to Europe. In the Islamic world, sophisticated cooling techniques flourished centuries ahead of their European counterparts. Persian ice houses, or yakkuls, featured advanced architecture with conical shapes, thick insulating walls, and subterranean chambers. Some even included ingenious wind-catching towers that directed cool air into the structure, further preserving the stored ice. In China, too, imperial ice storage was practiced as early as the Tang dynasty. Ice was collected in winter, stored in massive underground chambers, and carefully rationed for use in the palace kitchens during the sweltering summer months. These ancient systems reflect the universal human desire to tame the seasons, to hold winter's gift against the heat of summer. Even in regions where winter ice was unavailable, medieval people found creative ways to exploit natural cooling. In mountainous areas, cool caves and stone cellars provided refuge from summer heat. High-altitude communities sometimes stored snow and ice in sheltered depressions, covered with layers of insulating vegetation or stone. These makeshift coolers extended the life of perishable foods without complex machinery. In some monasteries and wealthier estates, underground chambers were built not only for storing ice, but for maintaining cooler temperatures year-round. These cold rooms were used to keep dairy, cured meats, and beverages at stable, safe temperatures even as the summer sun beat down above. The thick stone walls and carefully chosen building sites took advantage of natural insulation long before the science of refrigeration was fully understood. For the vast majority of medieval people, however, such luxuries were far beyond reach. Most peasants and townsfolk had no access to ice houses or cool storage. They continued to rely on the ancient, time-tested methods of salting, drying, fermenting, and pickling. For them, the idea of chilled fruit or fresh milk in summer remained the privilege of lords, clergy, or distant rulers. Despite its limitations, the practice of ice harvesting and early cooling demonstrated medieval people's remarkable adaptability. With simple tools and careful planning, they turned one of nature's harshest elements into a valuable resource. Their ingenuity foreshadowed the more sophisticated refrigeration technologies that would eventually transform food storage forever. As we leave the quiet darkness of the ice house behind, we see that medieval food preservation was never about any single method. It was a web, a network of strategies, where failure in one area could be offset by success in another. As the wider medieval world toiled through its daily struggles of sustenance, preservation, and survival, a quieter, more deliberate rhythm pulsed behind the high stone walls of monasteries. Here, far from the noisy bustle of markets, the clatter of urban life, or the uncertainty of peasant farming, monks dedicated their lives not only to prayer and contemplation but to the mastery of practical knowledge, including the art of preserving food without the benefit of refrigeration. The monasteries of medieval Europe served as oases of order in a world often dictated by chaos. Guided by strict rules, most famously the rule of Saint Benedict, monastic communities lived by predictable schedules of work, worship, study, and care for their environment. Within these rhythms, food played both a spiritual and practical role. The monks did not merely eat to sustain their bodies, they viewed the production and stewardship of food as a sacred duty, one that required attention, discipline, and wisdom. Unlike many medieval peasants who scraped by on subsistence farming, monasteries often controlled large tracts of fertile land. They maintained vegetable gardens, orchards, vineyards, fish ponds, and herds of livestock. Their self-sufficiency allowed them to experiment and perfect many techniques that would eventually influence broader agricultural practices. The monks became experts in food preservation out of necessity. Their communities operated year-round, regardless of bad harvests, wars, or plagues outside their walls. They needed their food stores to last through long winters, fasting periods, and times when supplies from the outside world were disrupted. As a result, monasteries became laboratories of preservation, a place where tradition met methodical observation. One of the most profound contributions made by monasteries was the careful documentation of knowledge. Monks were among the few literate members of society, capable of reading, writing, and copying manuscripts. They recorded recipes, preservation techniques, crop rotations, and agricultural practices in detailed manuals. These texts ensured that wisdom was not lost with each generation, but instead accumulated and refined. Cheese-making was one such art that flourished within monastery walls. Different regions developed distinct varieties of cheese, many of which owe their origins to monastic experimentation. Trappist and Cistercian monks, for instance, became famous for their complex, aged cheeses that could sustain communities for months. They meticulously recorded the conditions under which cheese matured best: temperature, humidity, salting levels, and timing. Brewing was another monastic specialty. Monasteries often produced beer and ale not just for their own consumption, but for trade and hospitality. Brewing required an understanding of fermentation, hygiene, and storage. Monks carefully monitored the cleanliness of their barrels and vessels, the balance of ingredients, and the conditions that led to successful fermentation. In an age before germ theory, their meticulous habits prevented many of the failures that plagued less disciplined brewers. Vineyards, too, were cultivated with great care. Monasteries in regions such as Burgundy, Champagne, and the Rhineland advanced the cultivation of grapes and the refinement of winemaking. They studied the effects of climate, soil, and pruning methods, producing wines that were prized not only for liturgical use, but as valuable trade commodities. In addition to preserving food for their own needs, monasteries often served as suppliers for surrounding communities during times of scarcity. Their ample granaries, salted meats, fish ponds, and preserved fruits provided relief when famine struck the peasantry. This charitable role cemented the monastery's place at the center of medieval life, not only as spiritual refuges but as guardians of food security. Herbal preservation was another area where monastic wisdom flourished. Monks cultivated herb gardens, where medicinal and culinary plants grew side by side. They dried, preserved, and carefully stored herbs such as rosemary, thyme, sage, and lavender, which not only flavored food but offered medicinal benefits. Many monasteries kept detailed herbals, illustrated books describing the properties, uses, and preparation of plants that guided their daily practices. Cold storage techniques were also employed, especially in wealthier or more technologically advanced monasteries. Underground cellars, ice houses, and thick-walled pantries provided naturally cool environments for preserving perishables like butter, cream, cured meats, and root vegetables. Some monasteries even experimented with rudimentary forms of ventilation and insulation to maximize storage longevity. Beyond food itself, monasteries played an essential role in the preservation of agricultural breeds and varieties. Livestock raised by monastic communities were often selectively bred for productivity and resilience. Crops were cultivated with an eye toward yield, drought tolerance, and suitability for storage. In this way, monasteries became custodians not only of food but of biodiversity. The discipline and order of monastic life allowed for such careful attention to preservation. The daily structure ensured that tasks were performed on time, whether it was turning cheeses, stirring fermenting barrels, or tending crops. The collective nature of monastic living also meant that knowledge was shared, mistakes were studied, and improvements were systematically adopted. Interestingly, the monks did not always operate in isolation. They exchanged knowledge with lay farmers, merchants, and scholars. Pilgrims visiting monasteries often carried news of different practices from distant lands. In this way, monastic knowledge became part of a broader web of cultural exchange, spreading advanced preservation techniques far beyond the cloister walls. In times of turmoil, whether war, plague, or political upheaval, monasteries often stood as islands of continuity. When fields were left fallow and towns were abandoned, monks maintained their gardens, tended their herds, and continued recording their work. It is thanks in part to these patient, silent communities that so much medieval agricultural knowledge survived to inform later generations. As we leave the cool, orderly world of the monastery, we begin to see that medieval preservation was not merely a matter of survival but of accumulated wisdom, observation, and care. Every salted barrel, every turning of cheese, every line in a copied manuscript was an act of defiance against decay and time itself. As we move away from the cold, practical world of spoilage and failure, we begin to see another layer woven into the medieval relationship with food storage, a layer not of desperation, but of identity, community, and social meaning. In a world where survival was never guaranteed, the ability to preserve and store food took on significance far beyond mere sustenance. It became an expression of wealth, power, and shared tradition. The moment a medieval harvest was gathered, the work of storage and preservation began. But unlike today, where food often disappears into silent refrigerators behind closed doors, in medieval times this work was largely communal and deeply public. Families, villages, and entire communities came together for these tasks. The entire village might participate in drying fruit, slaughtering animals, salting fish, or pressing oil. These were not only practical labors, but also moments of shared purpose. Seasonal rhythms dictated these gatherings. The Great Autumn Slaughter, for example, was a time of both labor and festivity. As winter approached, livestock that could not be sustained through the cold months were butchered. Families gathered to process the meat, salting, smoking, rendering fat, preparing sausages and hams. Children learned from parents, neighbors lent hands, and stories were exchanged across generations. Fires burned through long nights as the work continued. In these moments, food storage became a form of community bonding. The knowledge of how to preserve was not written in books for most, it was embedded in these shared rituals. A young girl might learn how to properly pack salt around a ham while listening to songs sung by her grandmother. A boy might practice hanging herbs in the attic rafters while elders argued about the best time to harvest them. Knowledge passed like breath, woven into the daily rhythm of survival. Food storage also reflected one's social status. For the peasantry, storage was often modest, a few barrels of salted pork, a small root cellar, a stack of dried herbs. But for the nobility, storage became a display of abundance and wealth. The larders of castles overflowed with variety, exotic spices, imported dried fruits, wheels of aging cheese, barrels of preserved fish, and casks of wine. To walk into a lord's pantry was to see visible proof of his resources, power, and reach. The design of noble kitchens and storage areas reflected this wealth. Great pantries, buttery chambers, ice houses, and vaulted wine cellars were constructed with care and expense. Stewards and servants oversaw inventories, rotating stocks, monitoring spoilage, and ensuring that feasts could be prepared at any moment. The ability to produce a lavish banquet even in winter was a political statement, as much as a culinary feat. Feasts themselves were showcases of stored bounty. Winter festivals like Christmas, Epiphany, or Candelema's often featured preserved foods brought out from storage. Salted meats, dried fruits, aged cheeses, and spiced wines filled the tables. The ability to produce abundance during the lean months demonstrated not only survival but prosperity. Guests at these feasts were reminded of their host's wealth with every bite of rare delicacies, made possible by months of careful preservation. Beyond status and celebration, food storage also played an essential role in charity and religious duty. Monasteries, as we have seen, preserved food not only for themselves, but often distributed excess stores to the poor. Town guilds and wealthy merchants sometimes donated preserved goods to support orphanages, almshouses, or hospitals. During harsh winters or times of famine, these stores became lifelines for the vulnerable. The Church, ever present in medieval life, wove food preservation into its rituals and teachings. The calendar of fasts and feasts dictated when certain foods could be consumed. Fish preservation, for example, became vital as Christians abstained from meat on numerous holy days. Salted herring, dried cod, and smoked eel found their way onto tables across Europe, tying preservation practices directly to spiritual observance. Preservation also intersected with marriage and dowry customs. A young woman's ability to manage a household's stores was a mark of her preparedness for marriage. Dowries sometimes included barrels of salted meat, stores of dried grain, or wheels of cheese, a practical and valuable contribution to her new household's survival. In this way, preservation was not just a skill but a social art. It defined family roles, reinforced community bonds, reflected social hierarchies, and shaped daily rhythms. Even during moments of joy, like weddings or harvest festivals, the preserved foods on offer carried the invisible weight of labor, planning, and survival. Markets, too, were shaped by preservation. Merchants traded salted fish from coastal regions to inland towns. Dried fruits, honeyed preserves, pickled vegetables, and casks of ale moved between cities and countryside. The growing network of trade allowed preserved foods to become part of a broader economic system, connecting distant regions and diverse communities. And in these marketplaces, the preserved goods themselves became symbols of both necessity and luxury. A common peasant might buy a jar of imported dates, or a barrel of exotic spices as rare treasures, while local salted meats and dried apples were within more familiar reach. Even in death, food storage rituals appeared. Offerings of preserved food might be left at graves or shared during funeral feasts. These acts reflected both grief and gratitude, the preserved bounty serving as a final gesture of community solidarity and remembrance. Thus, food preservation in medieval times was never only about keeping food from spoiling. It was inseparable from the rhythms of life itself: birth, marriage, death, faith, status, celebration, and charity. Every barrel of salted pork, every string of drying herbs, every wheel of aging cheese carried a story far larger than its immediate purpose. For centuries, medieval people lived with the tools and knowledge they had, constantly refining methods to stretch food supplies across the unforgiving seasons. But even as these techniques sustained generations, humankind's curiosity and desire for greater control over nature quietly pushed forward. The slow, steady march toward refrigeration, a revolution that would eventually free people from the tyranny of spoilage, began not with sudden invention, but with small, deliberate steps. Long before electric refrigeration, medieval and early modern society sought out nature's own solution: ice. Where climates allowed, ice harvesting became one of the earliest forms of cold storage. In winter, blocks of ice were cut from frozen lakes, ponds, and rivers. Laborers wielded saws and chisels, carefully carving slabs that could weigh hundreds of pounds. The blocks were hauled by sled or cart to insulated ice houses, structures built partially underground, lined with straw, sawdust, or even salt to slow melting. These ice houses were remarkable feats of medieval ingenuity. Thick stone walls and domed ceilings minimized exposure to warmth. A well-maintained ice house could preserve ice for many months, sometimes well into the summer. But this luxury was reserved primarily for the wealthy, the nobility, and religious institutions that had the resources to construct and maintain them. For common folk, the benefits of ice storage were often out of reach. Peasants and small merchants continued to rely on traditional preservation methods, while the privileged few enjoyed chilled delicacies long after winter's end. In royal courts and grand manors, chilled drinks, fresh dairy, and preserved fruit stored alongside ice became symbols of refinement and sophistication. Even in warmer regions where natural ice was scarce, early attempts to create cold storage emerged. In the Middle East, Persia, and parts of India, ancient engineers developed structures known as yakhals, massive, cone-shaped buildings designed to create and store ice using clever combinations of insulation, evaporation, and nighttime temperatures. Though beyond the medieval European world, such technologies reflect the universal human desire to conquer heat and spoilage. The Renaissance and the centuries that followed brought gradual advances in scientific understanding. Scholars began to explore the principles of temperature, pressure, and gases. While medieval thinkers worked within the framework of humoral theory and natural philosophy, early modern scientists started asking different questions. What causes ice to form? Why does salt lower the freezing point of water? Could cold itself be artificially produced? By the 17th and 18th centuries, these inquiries laid the groundwork for refrigeration's eventual arrival. Experimenters like Robert Boyle, Antoine Lavoisier, and others began piecing together the scientific knowledge that would ultimately make mechanical refrigeration possible. During these centuries, imported luxuries also transformed European preservation practices. Sugar, once a rare spice, became increasingly available through colonial trade. Its arrival revolutionized food storage. Fruits could now be preserved in heavy syrups, jams, and jellies, methods that dramatically extended their shelf life and added to the aristocracy's growing variety of winter delicacies. The 18th and 19th centuries saw the expansion of large-scale ice harvesting as commercial industries. In America, ice was cut from lakes in New England and shipped as far away as India and the Caribbean, packed carefully aboard insulated vessels. This global trade in frozen water reflected both technological ingenuity and a growing demand for year-round freshness. But true refrigeration, the kind we know today, required something more: machines capable of creating cold artificially. The breakthrough arrived in the 19th century. Inventors such as Jacob Perkins, John Gorrie, and Carl von Linne developed early refrigeration technologies that compressed and expanded gases to absorb heat and lower temperatures. By the late 1800s, mechanical refrigeration had arrived in breweries, meat packing plants, and urban food markets. At first, these machines were large, expensive, and used mostly in industry or wealthy homes. But as technology improved, costs dropped and efficiency increased. By the early 20th century, electric refrigerators began appearing in middle-class households. What had once been the exclusive domain of lords and monasteries, the luxury of extended preservation, was now available to ordinary families. With refrigeration spread came a profound shift in human life. Seasonal eating patterns began to break down. Fresh milk could be kept safe for days instead of hours. Meat could be stored year-round without salting or smoking. Fruit and vegetables traveled vast distances without spoiling. The ancient urgency of preservation diminished. New culinary possibilities blossomed. And yet, even as modern refrigeration transformed the world, echoes of medieval preservation linger. We still enjoy salted meats, aged cheeses, fermented beverages, pickled vegetables, and dried fruits, not out of necessity, but for flavor, tradition, and cultural memory. These ancient methods, born of survival, remain beloved arts in kitchens across the world. Refrigeration also changed social rituals. The communal labors of salting, drying, and fermenting gave way to private storage behind refrigerator doors. The visibility of one's food stores, once a marker of household status, became hidden. The rhythms of feast and famine, so deeply tied to seasonal preservation, flattened into year-round abundance. And perhaps most ironically, our modern convenience has brought new vulnerabilities. With fresh food always available, many have lost the deep, generational knowledge of preservation once essential to survival. When power fails or supply chains falter, we are reminded how dependent we have become on technologies our ancestors never knew. The march toward refrigeration was not a single invention, but a long, winding path of trial, error, observation, and innovation. From the smoky rafters of medieval kitchens to the ice houses of manor estates, from Renaissance experiments to industrial breakthroughs, this journey reflects one of humanity's oldest struggles: to wrest a little more time from nature's relentless decay. As we arrive at the end of this quiet journey, through medieval kitchens, smoky pantries, and underground cellars, it becomes clear that food preservation in those days was far more than a technical necessity. It was a way of life. A rhythm. A living dialogue between human ingenuity and nature's steady, unyielding forces. The first great lesson from the medieval world is one of patience. Preservation was not hurried. It followed the seasons. Apples were harvested when they ripened, and only then could they be carefully wrapped for winter storage. Pigs were slaughtered in autumn, when the cooling air helped slow decay. Herbs were picked when their oils were strongest, then dried gently in shaded attics or hung above the hearth. Each act was timed with care, guided by generations of accumulated knowledge. Modern refrigeration allows us to sever this bond with time. Strawberries can be eaten in December. Tropical fruits arrive by air in any season. The shelves of the grocery store present a uniform world of endless choice. But with this freedom, we have lost that intimate awareness of nature's calendar. Few today know when root vegetables are harvested, or when geese are traditionally fattened. The patience that once governed food has faded. The second lesson is resilience. Medieval people faced failures regularly: spoiled casks, worm-eaten grain, rancid meat. But they adapted. When a batch of salted herring spoiled, perhaps they smoked the next catch instead. If mice invaded the barley, they tried harder to seal their stores the following year. Preservation was both a science and an art, learned through mistakes as much as through success. In today's world, where food arrives in sealed packages with printed expiration dates, the resilience of adaptation has diminished. We discard rather than salvage. We replace rather than repair. The fragility of modern convenience becomes visible when systems fail, when storms disrupt power grids, or pandemics interrupt supply chains. The medieval resilience, born from necessity, is something many no longer practice. The third lesson is communal knowledge. Preservation was rarely a solitary activity. Entire families, villages, and towns shared the labor of salting, drying, fermenting, and storing. Wisdom passed from grandparent to child, from neighbor to neighbor. The skills were deeply embedded in the fabric of daily life. A young girl knew how to turn milk into cheese by watching her mother. A boy learned to judge the readiness of fish for smoking by listening to his father. Today, many of these skills rest only in the hands of hobbyists and specialists. Few modern households salt their own hams, pickle their own vegetables, or dry their own herbs. The communal transmission of these arts has been largely severed, replaced by factory processes hidden far from view. While we have gained efficiency, we have lost much of the quiet, shared wisdom that once connected families and communities through the act of preservation. The fourth lesson is humility. Medieval people understood intimately how vulnerable they were to nature's forces. A hot spell could spoil stored butter. An infestation could destroy months of labor. Famine was never distant. This constant awareness of fragility fostered a cautious respect for food. Waste was rare. Scraps became broth. Bones became stock. Even peels, stems, and pits found second uses. In our era of relative abundance, this humility has faded for many. Perfectly edible food is discarded for minor blemishes. Mountains of waste accumulate. The reverence once shown for every preserved jar, every stored loaf, every salted cut of meat has been replaced, in many places, by casual indifference. The humility of the medieval kitchen offers a quiet rebuke to our careless abundance. The final lesson is one of creativity. Preservation was never simply about avoiding spoilage. It was about transformation. Grapes became wine. Milk became cheese. Cabbage became sauerkraut. Cucumbers became pickles. In these transformations, new flavors and textures emerged. Some of the world's most beloved foods are preserved foods, born from necessity but celebrated for their richness. Modern kitchens, though far more dependent on refrigeration, still embrace this creative legacy. Fermentation remains a thriving art. Pickling enjoys a revival. Curing meats and aging cheeses continue to honor centuries-old traditions. The creative impulse that once allowed people to survive still finds joyful expression today. As we reflect on the medieval world's struggle without refrigeration, we see a world of hardship, but also one of profound knowledge, adaptability, and care. The absence of refrigerators did not mean the absence of solutions. Instead, it led to a rich tapestry of practices that blended science, ritual, art, and community. The arrival of refrigeration did not erase these lessons entirely, but it did shift our relationship with food, time, and nature. What was once intimate became distant. What was once seasonal became constant. What was once shared labor became solitary consumption. And yet, the wisdom of those who salted, smoked, dried, and fermented remains with us, if we choose to listen. In the act of baking bread, in the slow fermentation of pickles, in the patient drying of herbs, the echoes of medieval preservation still whisper. They remind us of a time when every morsel was precious. When food was not simply consumed, but carefully tended. When survival was both a science and a story, told through generations in smoky kitchens and cool cellars. In remembering their struggles, we also remember our own humanity. As we come to the quiet close of our long, meandering walk through medieval kitchens and forgotten pantries, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of two vastly different worlds. One, ancient and patient, full of smoky rafters, clay jars, salted barrels, and well-worn hands. The other, humming softly behind sleek refrigerator doors, where glass shelves gleam and the chill hum of electricity fills the silence. The arrival of modern refrigeration was not simply a technological achievement. It was a quiet revolution that altered the very foundation of human life. The daily struggle that once consumed every household, how to keep food safe, how to stretch it through winter, how to survive failure, slowly disappeared from view. In the medieval world, preservation was a dance with nature. People did not control time, they worked within its limits. Each preserved ham, each tightly packed root cellar, each carefully dried herb represented not just food, but time captured for future need. The changing seasons brought with them urgency, purpose, and deep respect for the precarious balance of survival. Today, we rarely feel that urgency. The global food supply moves constantly, from hemisphere to hemisphere, farm to supermarket, crossing oceans and time zones to deliver fresh strawberries, in midwinter or tropical avocados year-round. Refrigeration made this possible. And with it came profound comfort. Refrigeration freed billions from the labor of constant preservation. It reduced spoilage, extended shelf life, and lowered the risks of famine. Perishable foods that once had narrow windows of safety, dairy, eggs, seafood, fresh vegetables, became safer, more accessible, and more abundant. Yet this convenience carries hidden costs. The ancient knowledge of food storage, the rhythms of salting, drying, fermenting, smoking, and cellaring, has faded from daily life. Generations who once learned preservation by hand now rely on machines that hum quietly in the background, performing the labor once shared by entire communities. Our relationship with food itself has shifted. In medieval times, food was intimate. A family's winter survival might rest on the success of one good harvest, one well-packed larder. Each meal carried the story of hands that prepared, preserved, and protected it across weeks or months. Now, food often arrives pre-wrapped, pre-cooled, pre-preserved by distant hands. We encounter it as a product, rather than a process. We consume without always knowing its journey, its season, or its fragility. Even our sense of celebration has changed. Medieval feasts were directly shaped by preservation cycles. Midwinter tables groaned with salted hams, dried fruits, and preserved sweets, each dish a quiet triumph over decay. Today, festive tables overflow with abundance, but much of that ancient triumph has been replaced by expectation. And yet, echoes of that earlier world remain. Fermented foods continue to enchant. Pickling enjoys resurgence. Artisan cheesemakers, brewers, butchers, and bakers carry forward traditions once born of necessity. In these crafts, we can still glimpse the patient ingenuity of medieval preservation. The cold, once a rare luxury reserved for nobles with ice houses, or monasteries with cool stone cellars, has become so ordinary that we barely consider it. But it remains one of the most transformative forces in human history. Cold storage has made global trade possible, improved nutrition, reduced waste, and supported growing populations. In doing so, It quietly reshaped economies, diets, and even how we live our daily lives. We often measure history by wars, kings, and empires. But the story of how people stored food, how they fought the slow, inevitable march of spoilage, tells a quieter, deeper story. It is the story of ordinary people. Mothers carefully hanging herbs, fathers hauling salted fish to market, children watching barrels sealed for the winter, communities gathering for slaughter, curing, and storage. These simple, daily acts ensured survival for countless generations long before refrigeration arrived. They remind us of how much we once relied on one another, on patient knowledge, and on the careful stewardship of food. Refrigeration has brought freedom from much of that labor. But as we open the refrigerator door and feel the cold rush against our skin, it is worth pausing to remember those who had no such luxury, who bent over smoking fires, who packed barrels with careful hands, who preserved not just food, but life itself. The world is forever changed by cold. But the quiet, ingenious world that came before, the world of medieval preservation, still whispers beneath our modern comforts. And perhaps, if we listen closely, we can carry forward both the wisdom of the past and the gifts of the present. Sleep well, now, as the ancient cellars close their doors, and the hum of modern refrigeration carries you gently into the night.